Hi there, my name's Tim and welcome to this daily devotional from Cornerstone Church, Abergavenny. I wonder if anyone's ever asked you this question. Which do you want first, the good news or the bad news? Which do you say? Think on that for a second, we'll come back to that. So the title of this devotional series is This is My Favourite Bible Verse. And that's actually really difficult because I have so many Bible verses that I really love. And unfortunately, a lot of my favourites were already taken. So I considered doing Philippians 4 verses 6 and 7 about the peace that passes all understanding that will fill our hearts and minds. But that was already taken. And I considered Galatians 2:20 about the life that I now live no longer is my own. Jesus lives in me. But that had already been done as well. And I also considered Deuteronomy 3 about King Og and his bedstead of iron. Really surprised no one had done that. But anyway, the verse I decided to go with is Ephesians 2 verse 4. And it's not just one of my favourite verses, it's also my favourite 2 words in the Bible. Let's read it in context here. So this is Ephesians 2 verses 1 to 8. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. And here's these 2 words, verse 4. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. What amazing, powerful words. This is the ultimate good news, bad news situation. So which order did you choose? I always choose to hear the bad news first. And this is the order that seems to be always in the Bible. Bad news first, then the good news. And in this passage, we have the ultimate bad news. You were dead. Doesn't get much worse than that. And this is the story of every single one of us, lost in our sin, cut off from God, far from him. But God, because of his great love, his grace, his mercy, was willing to sacrifice himself so that we might be made alive in him. What a turnaround. But these 2 words, but God, appear many, many times in the Bible. I'd like to read just a few of them. Genesis 41, verse 16. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Psalm 9 verse 18, but God will never forget the needy, the hope of the afflicted will never perish. Psalm 66 verse 19, but God has surely listened and has heard my prayer. Acts 3 verse 15, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. Acts 7 verse 9, because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt, but God was with him. Romans 5 verses 7 and 8. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 26 and 27. Not many of you were wise by human standards, not many were influential, not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. 2 Corinthians 12 verse 3. I do not know, but God knows. And finally, Matthew 19 verse 26. Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. What do these but God verses tell us? They tell us that God has the final word, and that not even death can have the final word when God is around. Have a great day.